Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Sophia, and with me is James. Today, we'll talk about something very important for your English learning journey. How to think in English. This is a great way to boost your fluency and speak more naturally.
That's right. Many people, when learning a new language, translate everything from their native language into English in their heads. But this takes time and makes it harder to speak quickly. Thinking directly in English can help you avoid this problem. It's like a shortcut to becoming fluent faster.
Exactly. But how do you do that? You might ask, how can I start thinking in English? Well, it's not something that happens overnight, but with practice, it becomes easier. One way to begin is by surrounding yourself with English. You can do this by changing the language on your phone or computer to English. This simple change can make you read, think, and respond in English more often.
Yes, and when you look at something like a cup of coffee, instead of thinking about the word in your own language, try to think about the word coffee in English. Or, if you are looking at a window, think, that's a window in English. You're training your brain to connect the English word with the object directly without translation.
Another great tip is to start with simple words or sentences. For example, when you're doing something easy like brushing your teeth, think about it in English. You can say to yourself, I'm brushing my teeth, or I need to buy more toothpaste. This helps you get comfortable with everyday English.
And don't worry if you can't remember all the words. It's okay to think with the words you already know. For example, if you don't know the word for toothpaste, just use the word brush and think, I need to buy more brush. The more you do this, the more words you'll learn over time. The important thing is to practice, and little by little, you'll learn more words and phrases.
Yes, practice is key. You can also try to think about what you're going to do next. So, if you're getting ready for the day, you can think, I will make breakfast, or I need to go to work. These simple sentences will get your brain used to thinking in English.
Another thing that can help is talking to yourself in English. It might sound strange, but it works. For example, when you're alone, describe what you're doing in English. You can say things like, I am cooking, or I'm going for a walk. It's a good way to practice without any pressure.
That's a really good point. Talking to yourself in English helps build confidence too. You don't need to worry about making mistakes because no one is listening. You can even practice having small conversations with yourself. For example, ask yourself, what should I eat today? Then answer, I think I'll eat a sandwich. Simple conversations like this can help you practice thinking in English without feeling stressed.
And don't forget, you can use the words you already know. For example, if you're still learning new vocabulary, that's okay. Start with the words and phrases you're comfortable with and build from there. You don't need to use big words to practice thinking in English. Start small and grow over time.
A fun way to challenge yourself is to give yourself a little English time every day. Pick a time during your day, like in the morning or before bed, and decide that during that time, you will only think in English. It doesn't have to be long, just 5 or 10 minutes. The more you practice, the easier it will become to think in English naturally.
That's a great idea. You can also try labeling things around your home. If you're still learning new vocabulary, you can write the English words on small pieces of paper and put them on objects like the door, the table, or the fridge. Every time you see these words, your brain will remember them, and soon you'll start thinking of these things in English without even trying.
Yes, it's like training your brain. The more you see the words and practice thinking in English, the more automatic it becomes. Just like when you first learned how to drive a car at first, it feels difficult and you have to think about everything. But after some time, it becomes automatic. The same thing happens when you think in English.
Another good method is to set small goals for yourself. Maybe your first goal is to think in English for 5 minutes every day. Then, as you get better, you can try for 10 or 15 minutes. The key is to keep improving a little bit every day. Small steps lead to big changes.
Yes, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes when they're learning a new language, and that's completely okay. What's important is that you keep practicing and keep pushing yourself to think in English. The more you practice, the better you'll get.
That's so true. Mistakes are just part of the learning process. So, if you're trying to think in English and you get stuck, don't worry, just keep going. Over time, it will become easier, and soon you'll find yourself thinking in English more naturally.
Absolutely. So start small, practice every day, and don't worry about being perfect. The goal is to improve step by step. You'll be amazed at how much progress you can make just by thinking in English a little bit each day.
So, in part 1, we talked about some ways to start thinking in English, like using simple words, talking to yourself, and practicing a little every day. But now let's dive a bit deeper. Let's explore how you can improve your thinking in English by creating more specific habits and routines.
That's right. It's important to turn this practice into a habit, just like brushing your teeth or drinking water. When you do something every day, it becomes part of your routine, and soon, it's just something you do without thinking too much about it. And this is the same when it comes to thinking in English. So let's talk about how you can make thinking in English a daily habit.
One good idea is to link thinking in English with something you already do every day. For example, if you drink coffee in the morning, make it a rule that every time you drink coffee, you will think in English. You can think about simple things like, this coffee is hot, or I need more sugar. Or, if you go for a walk every day, try thinking about what you see in English like, the sky is blue, or there's a big tree. By doing this, you're making thinking in English part of your daily routine.
Another great way to create a habit is to think in English during your commute, whether you're walking, driving, or taking the bus. Let's say you're on your way to work or school. Instead of just listening to music or thinking about your day in your own language, use this time to think in English. You can describe what you see out the window, or even plan your day in English. For example, you could think, when I get to work, I will write an email, or I need to buy some milk after work.
Yes, and if you're walking or taking the bus, you can also look around and describe what's happening in English. You might see a car, a shop, or some people walking their dogs. Try to describe them in English in your head. This way, you're training your brain to use English in real-life situations, which will help you think in English faster and more naturally.
And you don't always need to think in full sentences. Sometimes, just thinking in short phrases or even individual words can help. For example, if you see a car, just think car. If you see a tree, think tree. Then, as you get better, you can start building sentences like, that's a red car, or the tree is tall, over time. You'll notice that you start to think in English more easily, and it will feel less like a task and more like a normal part of your day.
Another idea is to use the word of the day method. Every day, pick one new word or phrase in English and try to use it throughout the day. For example, if your word of the day is delicious, you can use it when you're thinking about food, like this sandwich is delicious. Or I want to eat something delicious for dinner. The more you use the word, the more natural it becomes, and soon, you won't have to think about it, it'll just come to you.
That's a fantastic method. And if you're not sure where to find new words, you can use simple resources like a dictionary app, or even just pay attention to words you hear or see during the day. If you hear someone say a new word, write it down, and later, look it up. Then try to use it in your thinking or practice it during your English time.
Also, if you like watching TV or listening to music, this can help you think in English too. If you watch English movies or TV shows, don't just watch them passively. Instead, try to think about what the characters are saying in English. If there's a conversation on the screen, pause for a moment and think, what would I say in this situation? Or how would I respond? This helps you imagine real-life conversations and practice thinking in English.
And with music, you can use the lyrics of your favorite English songs to help you think in English. Try to listen to the words, and after the song ends, think about what the song was about. For example, if it's a love song, you can think, this song is about love, or the singer is talking about someone they miss. Even though it's a small exercise, it keeps your brain active in English and helps you develop the habit of thinking in the language.
Yes, and another great way to train your brain is to ask yourself questions throughout the day, but in English. For example, when you wake up, ask yourself, what am I going to do today? Or what should I eat for breakfast? Then, try to answer the question in English. It's like having a mini conversation with yourself, and it really pushes you to think in English naturally.
That's true. And don't worry if it feels hard at first. It's normal for your brain to want to switch back to your native language when you're just starting out. But with practice, you'll find that it becomes easier and more natural to stay in English, especially if you keep asking yourself simple questions and answering them throughout the day.
Also, try to create different scenarios in your mind. For example, if you're sitting at a cafe, think to yourself, what if I had to order my coffee in English? What would you say? I would like a coffee, please, or can I have a sandwich? These small mental exercises help prepare your brain to think and respond in English in real-life situations, even when you're not speaking out loud.
And if you have a hobby or something you enjoy doing, try to think about it in English too. Let's say you love cooking when you're in the kitchen. Think about the ingredients, the tools, and the steps in English. For example, if you're making a salad, think, I need lettuce, tomatoes, and cucumbers, or I'm going to chop the vegetables. This way, you're connecting something you love with thinking in English, and it feels more enjoyable and natural.
Yes, and the same goes for any hobby, whether it's sports, drawing, or reading. If you like playing basketball, think about the game in English. I'm going to shoot the ball, or I need to pass to my teammate. The more you do this, the more comfortable you'll become with thinking in English in all areas of your life.
Another idea is to create a diary in English. You don't need to write long paragraphs, just a few sentences each day. You can write things like, today I went to the park, or I met a friend for lunch. Writing in English forces you to think in English, and it also helps you remember new words and practice grammar in a fun way.
And don't forget, it's important to be patient with yourself. Thinking in English takes time, but the more you practice, the faster you'll improve. Even if it's just for a few minutes every day, the more consistent you are, the more progress you'll see over time.
Yes, every little bit helps, so find ways to include English in your daily routine, whether it's during your commute, while doing a hobby, or even while relaxing. The more you expose yourself to English, the more your brain will get used to thinking in English, and soon it will feel natural. Keep practicing, and remember, small steps lead to big results. Now that we've talked about building daily habits for thinking in English, let's go even deeper. One of the biggest challenges for learners is getting comfortable with thinking in English during conversations, especially when talking to other people. So in this part, we're going to focus on how to train your mind to think in English, not just when you're alone, but also when you're interacting with others.
That's a great point. When you're speaking with someone, it's very common to feel pressure. You might start worrying about finding the right words or making mistakes, which can slow you down. But thinking in English can help you speak more naturally because your brain is already used to processing English.
Exactly, and one of the best ways to prepare for conversations is by thinking ahead. Let's say you're about to meet a friend or attend a class. Before you even get there, start thinking about what you might talk about. For example, you can think, what will I say when I meet them? Or what questions might they ask me? This way, when the conversation starts, you're already prepared, and your brain has had time to think in English before you start speaking.
That's a really helpful technique. You can also prepare by thinking about the topics that usually come up in conversations. For example, if you know you're going to talk about work, you can think in English about your day at work before the conversation begins. You can say to yourself, I finished a project today, or I had a meeting with my boss. This makes it easier to jump into the conversation without needing to translate everything in your head.
Another way to practice is by imagining different conversation scenarios. For example, if you're going to a restaurant, you can think about how you would order your food in English. Before you even walk in, you can think, I'm going to order a salad and water, or I'll ask for the bill when I'm done. This mental preparation helps build your confidence, and it makes it easier to respond in English when you actually need to speak.
Yes, and you can also take it a step further by practicing both sides of the conversation. So, if you're thinking about going to a restaurant, imagine not only what you would say, but also what the other person might say in response. For example, you can think, I'll ask for a salad, and then imagine the waiter saying, would you like anything to drink? This way, you're training your brain to think about both sides of the conversation, which helps you respond faster and more naturally in real-life situations.
That's a really good strategy. And the more you practice these conversation scenarios in your head, the more comfortable you'll become when speaking to real people. It's like rehearsing for a performance. When the moment comes, you'll feel more prepared and confident because you've already practiced.
Another tip is to listen carefully to native speakers and try to predict what they're going to say. For example, if you're watching a TV show or a YouTube video in English, pause it before the person speaks and ask yourself, what would I say in this situation? Then play the video and see if what they say is similar to what you were thinking. This helps you understand how native speakers think and respond in conversations, and it trains your brain to think faster in English.
That's a great exercise, and it's also important to remember that conversations aren't just about words, they're also about listening. When you're having a conversation in English, try to really listen to what the other person is saying. Don't just focus on what you want to say next. By listening closely, your brain stays in English, and it's easier to continue thinking in English instead of switching back to your native language.
Yes, listening is such an important part of thinking in English. And when you listen carefully, you can learn new phrases or ways of saying things. For example, if someone says, "What have you been up to lately?" Instead of the usual "How are you?" your brain starts to pick up new ways to communicate in English. Over time, you'll find yourself thinking about those phrases in your own conversations.
That's a really good point, and don't be afraid to imitate what you hear. If you hear a new phrase or a way of saying something that you like, try using it in your own thinking. For example, if someone says, "I'm feeling under the weather," which means they're not feeling well, you can start thinking, "I'll use that phrase next time I'm sick." Imitating native speakers helps you think and speak more like them over time.
Yes, imitation is a powerful tool. And another great way to train your brain to think in English is by asking yourself questions throughout the day, especially about things that interest you. Let's say you're watching a documentary about nature. You can ask yourself, "What's my favorite animal?" Or "Where would I like to travel?" Then answer the question in English. This kind of thinking keeps your mind active in English and helps you practice expressing your thoughts.
And the key is to keep your thoughts simple at first. You don't need to think in complicated sentences or try to sound perfect. For example, if you're thinking about your favorite animal, you can just say, "I like dogs," or "I like elephants." Start with simple thoughts, and as you get better, you can expand them. Over time, you'll be able to think in more complex sentences without even realizing it.
Yes, and if you ever get stuck while thinking in English, don't worry. It's normal to forget words or not know how to express something. When that happens, just think around the word you don't know. For example, if you can't remember the word for refrigerator, you can think, "The cold thing where I put my food." The goal is to keep thinking in English, even if you don't know every word.
That's a really important point. You don't need to know every word to think in English. If you keep practicing, you'll notice that your brain gets better at finding ways to express your thoughts even when you don't know the exact word. The more you practice, the easier it will become to find the right words.
Another fun way to practice thinking in English is by playing word games with yourself. For example, you can challenge yourself to name all the things you see in a room in English. If you're in the kitchen, you can think, "There's a table, a chair, a fridge, a sink," and so on. Or, if you're outside, you can describe what you see, like, "I see trees, cars, birds, and the sun." This helps you stay in English mode and strengthens your vocabulary at the same time.
That's a great idea, and if you want to take it a step further, you can play a 5 senses game. This means thinking about what you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch in English. For example, if you're at a cafe, you can think, "I see people drinking coffee, I hear soft music, I smell fresh pastries, I taste my sweet coffee, and I touch the warm cup." This way, you're practicing thinking in English while also being aware of your surroundings.
That's a really fun way to practice, and it's also a great way to expand your vocabulary. By thinking about all 5 senses, you're using more descriptive language, which will help you when you're speaking or writing in English. It's also a good mental exercise to keep your brain active in English, even when you're doing something as simple as sitting in a cafe.
Yes, and speaking of mental exercises, another tip is to set aside some time each day to do a thought diary in English. This is where you spend 5 or 10 minutes writing down your thoughts in English, just like you would in your own language. You don't need to write long paragraphs, just a few sentences about your day, your plans, or how you're feeling. The act of writing helps you organize your thoughts in English, and it trains your brain to think more clearly in the language.
And if you're not sure what to write, you can start by asking yourself simple questions like, what did I do today? Or what's something good that happened? Then answer them in English. You can also try writing about things you're looking forward to, like, I'm excited to meet my friends tomorrow, or I'm going to the park this weekend. This helps you think about both the past and the future in English, which is great for improving your fluency.
Yes, and the more you practice, the more natural it becomes to think in English. It's like building a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. So whether you're alone or talking to someone, try to keep your thoughts in English. Even if it's challenging at first, it gets easier with time and practice.
And remember, it's okay if your thoughts aren't perfect. You don't need to have perfect grammar or know every word. The goal is to keep thinking in English and to practice as much as you can. The more you practice, the more natural it will feel, and soon you'll find yourself thinking in English without even trying.
Absolutely. So whether you're preparing for a conversation, describing your day, or just practicing on your own, keep pushing yourself to think in English. It's one of the best ways to boost your fluency and get more comfortable with the language. Keep going, and remember, every little bit of practice helps. Now that we've explored how to practice thinking in English both on your own and in conversations, let's focus on something even deeper: the mindset you need to truly boost your fluency. Thinking in English isn't just about practicing words and phrases. It's about training your brain to stay in English, even when things feel difficult or overwhelming. This part is all about building the right attitude and finding ways to stay consistent with your practice.
Exactly. One of the most important things to remember when you're trying to think in English is that it's okay to make mistakes. Sometimes, learners are afraid to think or speak in English because they don't want to make errors. But the truth is, mistakes are part of the learning process. When you're thinking in English, it's not about being perfect. It's about staying in the language even when it's hard.
Yes, that's such a crucial point. The more you accept that making mistakes is natural, the more confident you'll become. When you're thinking in your native language, you don't worry about whether every word is perfect. You just think and speak naturally. You need to bring that same mindset into English. Allow yourself to think freely without stopping to worrying if it's correct. The more relaxed you are, the faster your thoughts will flow in English.
And remember, fluency doesn't mean knowing every single word. It means being able to express your thoughts without constantly stopping to translate. So even if you don't know a word in English, keep going. You can always use simpler words to describe what you mean. For example, if you don't know the word umbrella, you can say, the thing I use when it rains. Thinking like this helps you stay in English without switching back to your native language.
That's right. And this is where mindset plays a huge role. Instead of thinking, I don't know this word, I should stop, try to think, I'll find another way to say this. This problem-solving attitude is what will help you build confidence. When you practice thinking in English like this, you're training your brain to stay in the language and adapt to challenges.
Another important part of developing this mindset is not being too hard on yourself. Language learning is a journey, and fluency takes time. If you expect to think perfectly in English right away, you'll only feel frustrated. But if you focus on the small improvements you make every day, you'll see progress. It's like building a house. You don't build the whole thing in one day. You lay one brick at a time, and slowly, the house takes shape.
Yes, and this is why it's so important to celebrate your progress, even the small wins. If today you manage to think in English for 5 minutes, that's great. Tomorrow, you might do 10 minutes. Over time, you'll notice that it gets easier and easier. And before you know it, you'll be able to think in English for much longer without even realizing it.
That's so true. And another thing that can help is to immerse yourself in English as much as possible. The more you surround yourself with English, the more natural it will feel to think in the language. You can immerse yourself by listening to English podcasts, watching English TV shows, or even reading simple articles or books. The key is to expose your brain to English in different ways so that it becomes a regular part of your environment.
And when you're listening or watching something in English, try to actively engage with it. Don't just watch or listen passively. For example, if you're watching a movie, think about what the characters are saying and how you would respond if you were in that situation. You can pause the movie and ask yourself, what would I say in this moment? This helps you practice thinking in English in real-life contexts, even if you're just watching from home.
That's a really good technique, and it's also important to mix different types of media. For example, you can watch TV shows for casual conversations, listen to news reports for more formal language, or read blogs for everyday expressions. Each type of media gives you a different style of English to practice with. The more variety you expose yourself to, the more flexible your thinking in English will become.
Yes, and speaking of flexibility, another great way to train your brain is by thinking in English even when you're doing everyday tasks. We talked earlier about describing things around you, but you can also take it further by imagining conversations or situations in your head. For example, if you're cooking dinner, imagine that you're teaching someone how to cook the meal in English. You can think, first, I'm going to chop the vegetables. Then, I'll boil the water. This helps you practice thinking in complete sentences and organizing your thoughts in English.
That's a great exercise, Sophia, and it works for any situation. Let's say you're driving or walking somewhere you can imagine that you're giving directions in English. You can think, turn left here, or go straight for 2 blocks. Or if you're in a store, you can imagine that you're asking a question, like, how much does this cost? Or do you have this in a different color? These kinds of mental exercises help you get used to thinking in English in everyday scenarios.
And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're surrounded by people speaking English, don't shy away from it. Even if you're just listening, it's a great opportunity to practice. Try to follow the conversation in your head and think about what you would say if you were part of it. You don't need to jump in right away, but by practicing mentally, you're preparing yourself for the next time you do have a conversation in English.
Yes, and that brings us to another key point. Don't be afraid to make mistakes in real conversations. When you're learning to think in English, it's easy to feel nervous or embarrassed if you can't find the right word or if you make a mistake. But remember, everyone makes mistakes when they're learning a new language. Native speakers will understand, and most people are happy to help. The more you practice speaking and thinking in English, the more confident you'll become, and the fewer mistakes you'll make over time.
Exactly. It's all about building confidence through practice. And sometimes, the best way to learn is by making mistakes. When you make a mistake, you often remember the correction, and it helps you improve. So instead of seeing mistakes as a bad thing, try to see them as a chance to learn and grow.
Another thing that can really help is to find a language partner or a group of people who are also learning English. If you can, find someone to practice with regularly. You can have conversations about anything in your day, your hobbies, or even the weather. The goal is to have real conversations in English where you can practice thinking and speaking in the language at the same time. The more you talk, the more natural it will feel to think in English during those conversations.
Yes, having a language partner is a great way to keep motivated, and it's also a fun way to practice. You can challenge each other to think in English for longer periods of time or even come up with new scenarios to talk about. The more you practice with others, the more confident you'll become in thinking and speaking in English.
And don't forget, it's important to be kind to yourself during this process. Thinking in a new language takes time and effort, but every bit of practice helps. Even on the days when it feels hard, remember that you're making progress just by trying. Some days will be easier than others, but as long as you keep going, you'll improve.
Absolutely. It's all about persistence and patience. Language learning isn't a race, and everyone moves at their own pace. The important thing is that you're consistent. Even if you only practice thinking in English for a few minutes each day, that time adds up. Over weeks and months, you'll notice that you're thinking in English more naturally and with less effort.
So, to summarize everything we've talked about today, thinking in English is one of the most powerful ways to boost your fluency. It helps you stay in the language, practice vocabulary, and get comfortable with forming sentences in your head. The key is to practice every day, use simple thoughts at first, and build up to more complex ideas as you get better.
And remember, it's okay to make mistakes and forget words. That's all part of the learning process. The most important thing is to keep going, stay motivated, and find fun ways to practice thinking in English, whether it's through everyday activities, media, or conversations with others.
Yes, and the more you immerse yourself in English, the faster you'll see progress. So keep practicing, stay patient, and don't be afraid to push yourself to think in English, even when it feels challenging. Over time, it will get easier and you'll feel more confident in your ability to think, speak, and understand English fluently.
Exactly. And on that note, we want to thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. We hope these tips help you in your journey to boost your fluency by thinking in English. Remember, the more you practice, the better you'll become.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tips on learning English. Also, share this podcast with your friends and family who are also learning English so you can help each other grow. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.